Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the ILO discussion series, a regular engagement of government officials, international organizations, trade union leaders, development and human rights specialists, and business representatives. This series is meant to provide insights and work on major issues that is happening in the world of work here in the US as well as in the global arena. Today's discussion is a part of the ILO's Office for the United States and Canada's contribution to the 16 days of action on gender-based violence. And we have produced 8 social media social cards over the last 2 weeks, which features the key policy statements by government officials, employers, workers' organizations, and the US, within the US and Canada. I'm pleased to announce that all of our speakers here today have generously lent their voice to this important campaign to end violence and harassment and gender-based violence in the world of work. The World Health Organization estimates that 1 in 3 women worldwide have been subject to physical or sexual violence. These crimes are largely unreported, and many women and men suffer in silence. This is an unacceptable attack on people's human and labor rights, and we call upon all actors, governments, employers, workers, civil society, men and women everywhere to join the efforts to end the insidious behavior from the world of work and society more broadly. Now, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce my colleague, Manuela Tomé, who is the Director of Conditions of Work and Employment Program for the International Labor Organization. Manuela was also the lead coordinator on ILO Convention 189 on domestic workers, as well as on Convention 190 on violence and harassment in the world of work. Here via video is from Geneva is Manuela Tomé's message.
Convention 190 was the last convention to be adopted by the International Labour Conference, and the first, together with Recommendation 206, to state clearly and loudly that there is no place for violence and harassment in the world of work. It also states what is to be done and by whom to prevent and address it, based on a shared understanding of what violence and harassment is. It also recounts that while responsibilities and mandates are distinct, states, employers and workers, and their representative organizations all have a role to play and need to act in sync for achieving utmost effectiveness. Convention 190 is also a gender-responsive standard. It recognizes that violence and harassment affects women and girls disproportionately. It singles out gender-based violence and harassment as one important form of violence and harassment. It acts on both the symptoms and causes of gender-based violence and harassment. It recounts that domestic violence has an impact on the workplace and that measures need to be taken to mitigate such impact. The world of work covers also places where women often work, in private households as domestic workers or in sectors and occupations, whether in the formal or informal economy, in which interface with third parties such as clients, students, patients, and the like is the norm. The new standards call for an inclusive, integrated, and gender-responsive approach to eliminating violence and harassment. At the time in which Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 were negotiated in June 2019, we could not anticipate the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic and could not anticipate how relevant the new standards would be in the response to and recovery from the pandemic. Images of retail staff being physically or verbally assaulted by clients, exasperated by empty shelves, or nurses being thrown chlorine bleach out of fear of contracting the virus have become commonplace. Cases of online sexual harassment had seen a 5-fold upsurge in some countries. Teleworking has allowed businesses to keep afloat and people to make a living while shielding them from the virus. But for many women, it has also meant a greater risk of domestic violence and mental health problems because of the heavy additional care work due to lockdown measures and unchanged expectations regarding their professional performance. Has Convention 190 made any difference to the daily life of women and men thus far? It's still early times to draw any conclusions. 10 countries have ratified the convention, and a further 20 have finalized, are in the middle of, or are about to finalize their internal process of ratification. This is encouraging as it is happening in the midst of a terrible pandemic, but ratification is not occurring fast enough. We know that ratification per se will not make the problem disappear, but reflects a commitment of states to act and engage with employers and workers and their representative organizations to deliver on the promises of the convention. Two lessons are emerging from country experiences. There is a growing realization that violence and harassment is a matter of gender equality, as gender discrimination often fuels violence and harassment at work. But it is also an occupational safety and health issue, as violence and harassment is often an occupational risk factor and a source of major health problems. Preventive and corrective actions, therefore, need to operate along these two axes, and these two worlds need to come together. Data on violence and harassment are key to uncovering this scourge, set priorities for policy interventions, dispel wrong assumptions, and monitor their effectiveness. We have joined forces with Gallup and the Lloyd's Register Foundation to shed light on this phenomenon and get also a sense of who reports instances of violence and harassment and to whom, and the reasons for not reporting. This will be key to guide policy action. The challenges ahead are many, but it is undeniable that there will be no building forward better if violence and harassment, and gender-based violence and harassment in particular, continue to haunt us in the future.
Thank you, Manuela, for your inspiring message and call to action. I'm truly grateful to Manuela to record this video message, particularly since she has just completed 2 weeks of very intense negotiations at the International Labor Conference on the issue of inequalities in all of its manifestations. Now I'd like to turn to our moderator today, who will start the webinar entitled A World of Work, Free from Violence and Harassment. Robin Runge is the Equality and Inclusion Co-Director at Solidarity Center. Robin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It is an honor and a privilege to be with this esteemed group today and to serve as a moderator for this incredibly important conversation. As we just heard from Manuela, the convention offers so much opportunity and so much has already transpired. And we're going to hear today from a group of individuals who are continuing to work on that from the different perspectives that Manuela laid out for us, the important role that governments play, employers play, and that unions and workers' rights organizations play. It has been my privilege at the Solidarity Center to continue this work with our global partners to really ensure that we make C-190, the convention, real for all workers, as she mentioned, informal workers, formal workers, and to continue to prioritize ending gender-based violence and harassment during the pandemic, which has not been difficult, sadly, for the reasons that she mentioned. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to our first speaker. What we're going to do is hear from each of our speakers for about 4 or 5 minutes, and then we have reserved time for questions. So it's really important for those of you who are watching and listening to our wonderful speakers, if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature and ask them, and we will hopefully get to as many of them, if not all of them, before the end of our time today. So our first speaker is Wendy Choon, who's the director of the Women's Bureau at the U.S. Department of Labor, who's going to share from her perspective the importance of addressing these issues. Thank you so much, Wendy. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Robin, and also to the ILO for inviting the United States Department of Labor to this really critical discussion. Just really grateful to be part of this community of practice. So as Robin said, my name is Wendy Choon. I direct the Women's Bureau, which is a 100-year-old agency within the Department of Labor and the only government agency that's mandated by Congress to work exclusively on issues that affect women in the workplace and also to represent the needs of wage earning women in the public policy process. which we do through being a trusted source for research and data and advocacy. And we also innovate through several grants programs. So, as we emerge from the pandemic, as everyone has said, we are really being called to action by our president to address directly the longstanding gaps in public policy and programs that have perpetuated gender and racial inequities in our country. And one part of this call to action is formulating a whole of government approach to addressing gender-based violence and harassment, including in the world of work. And that's through the White House Gender Policy Council. And I'd like to come back to that in just a minute and say a few words more. But first, really just to recognize that here, as it is around the world, the pandemic has made workers increasingly vulnerable, as Manuela said, to gender-based violence and harassment in their world of work, whether it's a traditional workplace, working remotely from home, as she said, or in the informal economy. And we know from recent research conducted by the National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice that after COVID social distancing requirements took effect and associated physical and social isolation, in the US alone, domestic violence incidents rose by more than 8%. So this, what everybody talks about, the shadow pandemic, really revealed itself not just in the US, but obviously worldwide. We know that a safe working environment really is the cornerstone to our plan to build back better. The United States was really proud to vote in favor of adopting Convention 190 on violence and harassment and its accompanying recommendation, which provide a really useful framework for countries like the United States and agencies like the Department of Labor that are seeking to prevent and address violence and harassment in the world of work. We know violence in the world of work can be the direct results of domestic violence and can affect both women and men in all our diversity. Our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimate that more than 500,000 women each year will miss work due to intimate partner violence, which obviously threatens our economic security. There's another recent study that also estimated the lifetime cost of intimate partner violence, which totals more than $100,000 for women survivors, more than $20,000 for men survivors, and amounts to a total economic cost in the trillions. So as I was mentioning in the beginning, President Biden really has urged collaboration across US government agencies to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. This is the White House's National Strategy on Gender Equity and Equality, which just came out, makes really clear the implications gender-based violence and harassment has on women's safety and security in the workplace, and especially when they have limited bargaining power and fewer contractual and other rights at work. Stakes are absolutely higher for low-wage workers, including, as Manuela said, restaurant, janitorial workers, migrant workers, farm workers, those who are working in conditions of isolation, like often domestic workers and home health aides. So as a result, the White House Gender Policy Council is developing the United States' first ever national action plan to end gender-based violence. The plan is going to provide a whole of government approach to supporting survivors, promoting prevention, and shifting norms, really importantly. And the administration also is pledging new investments in prevention programs through the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, making its way through Congress now, which among other things calls for a coordinated awareness raising campaign on workplace impact of gender-based violence, a really critical look at barriers to survivors' economic security, and also the sufficiency of workplace readiness to support employees who experience gender-based violence, and also really importantly calls for expanded access to unemployment compensation for survivors. Finally, the Biden administration recognizes the importance of having not just sick leave, but safe leave that would permit eligible workers to receive paid leave for reasons that pertain to sexual assault, stalking, dating, and domestic violence. So all to say, the US commits as part of this global community and campaign to really take this opportunity for governments, unions, employers, private and public sectors to come together to take action towards ending gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for providing that incredibly important information. And it's so exciting to hear about the commitment from the Department of Labor, from your office, and from the president to addressing the impact of gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work, and in particular, domestic violence, which is one of the themes of the 16 days of activism. Next, we're really fortunate to hear from Rakesh Patri, who I had the privilege of getting to know in his role as the chair of the negotiations at the International Labor Congress for 2 years in 2018 and 2019 for the convention. And he is the Director General of International Affairs for Economic and Social Development in Canada. And he's going to share some of his reflections on C-190 from his experience and expertise. Thank you so much, Rakesh.
Thanks so much, Robin. Pleasure to see you again. And it's really a privilege and an honor to be a part of this panel with these wonderful panelists who are here today. This is a really important and timely discussion. And unfortunately, I think it has been a timely discussion for far too long. And if anything, it is even more timely and urgent now. It should be recognized as a fundamental human right that every person is entitled to a world of work free from violence and harassment. But unfortunately, we're not close to that yet. And in fact, as Manuela and others have said, the pandemic has really heightened these concerns. As we struggle to get through this pandemic, the most vulnerable workers are the ones that are being the most disproportionately impacted, not just financially, of course, but we're also seeing a rise in violence and harassment against essential and frontline workers, particularly those in the healthcare, food, and transport sectors. This cannot be tolerated, and those workers cannot be left to fend for themselves. It's incumbent on governments, employers, worker organizations, society in general, really, to work together in putting in place structures that provide protection and recourse for those individuals. And ILO Convention 190, I think, really takes major steps towards helping to provide that structure. It's really disappointing that it has taken the world as long as it has to develop the first treaty that speaks to this issue. But the challenging negotiations that we saw during the 190 negotiations really provide some insight into why it is so difficult to create an international treaty of this nature dealing with this topic. Canada was really proud to play a strong role in the development and negotiation of the convention. And throughout the negotiations, we saw the different perspectives that various key players have on this issue. This was not an easy negotiation by any means. It was difficult, contentious, long hours, lots of tears, many shed by me, I think, and more than a few moments where it didn't look like we were going to get to the finish line on this. There were challenges in how we define the term of violence and harassment, the scope that it covers, the roles and responsibilities of everyone involved, among other factors. But the greatest strength of the ILO, I think, is its tripartite nature, the fact that it is not just governments that are drafting this, but you have governments, employer and worker organizations all speaking with equal voices in the room. That's great, but of course it can be a challenge to get those voices to speak in unison on any issue, particularly one as challenging as this. Fundamentally, though, I think there was a recognition on the part of everyone involved and everyone in that room that they were creating history, but more importantly, creating a vital tool that can really be used to provide protection and fundamental rights for the most vulnerable. And it was that motivation, I think, that led us to develop this groundbreaking text for both a convention and a recommendation that can provide a roadmap to deal with violence and harassment in the world of work. There was also a recognition, I think, that this is just fundamentally the right thing to do. Violence and harassment is a serious safety and health hazard that has a high cost for both victims and enterprise performance alike. Eliminating harmful behaviors in the workplace benefits employees physically and psychologically, but it also benefits employers economically and governments, of course, as well. But adopting a text like this is not enough. We now need countries to ratify the convention and put in place legislation that backs it up. So let me speak to a minute for what Canada is doing on that front. We have not ratified the convention as yet, but we're actively working on it. And we applaud the 10 countries that have rapidly ratified it. We face a somewhat unique situation in Canada as a federated state where responsibility for the bulk of labor issues fall under the jurisdiction of our provinces and territories. We also want to ensure that we have structures in place to be in conformity with the provisions of a convention when we ratify it. So we are conducting technical reviews, not just in our federal jurisdiction, but in the jurisdiction of our 13 provinces and territories. COVID has slowed our progress a little bit, but we're actively working through that process and hope to be in a position to ratify this important convention in the near future. But let me take a minute to touch on how we're also addressing it domestically in Canada. Domestically, all jurisdictions across Canada have frameworks in place to address violence and harassment at work. At the federal level, the Government of Canada adopted a bill termed Bill C-65 in 2018 to amend our Canada Labour Code to create a single integrated approach to protecting private and public sector employees from harassment and violence in the workplace. The legislation basically requires employers to do three things. First, prevent incidents of harassment and violence. Second, respond effectively to those incidents when they do occur. And third, support those affected by harassment and violence in the workplace. It's noteworthy, I think, that Bill C-65 was used as a model for some elements of Convention 190. In order to support workplaces in complying with the new legislation and regulations, the Government of Canada also developed a number of tools and resources for employers and workers, including a sample workplace risk assessment, sample workplace harassment and violence prevention policy, an employer requirements checklist, and critically, a 1-800 number that really links employers and workers to government experts who can help them to navigate the harassment and violence provisions in our code and regulations. In addition, we launched the Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Fund to support projects that co-develop sector-specific tools and resources related to harassment and violence prevention, including tools and resources for psychological health and safety, with the goal of supporting behavioral change in the workplace. We also worked with employers, employees, unions, subject matter experts, advocacy groups, Indigenous groups, and health and safety reps to ensure that the new violence and harassment framework adequately responds to the needs of the workplaces where it applies. The dialogue that we had between governments and interested stakeholders, I think, was key to overcoming the conflicts and developing creative and effective solutions that were acceptable to all to address pressing workplace issues. It's one step, I think, towards addressing violence and harassment in the world of work, but we hope that this is a major step that can help us all to put an end to this issue. Thank you for that, Robin.
Thank you so much, Rakesh, for sharing both your reflections on the adoption of the convention and then also the great work that is being done in Canada by the tripartite partners. It's just tremendous. Next, we're going to turn to Jamil Bigio from USAID. She's the senior coordinator for gender equality and women's empowerment, and also the acting deputy assistant administrator for gender equality at USAID. So I'm going to turn to you, Jamil, to share with us some of the great work being done at USAID to end gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all and within this incredible panel to be reflecting on such an important issue. At USAID, we are deeply committed to helping build safe workplaces for all workers around the world. We recognize that it is crucial that we understand and address how gender-based violence undermines women's economic empowerment. It's a human rights abuse, it's a public health challenge, it's also a barrier to civic, social, political, and economic participation and development. So as part of the Biden-Harris administration's global agenda, under our national strategy on gender equity and equality, where you heard from my colleague at the Department of Labor, at USAID, we have a line of effort that we are elevating and driving forward. We have launched the Gender Equity and Equality Action Fund, which will focus on building women's economic security globally. Among our priorities, we will focus on dismantling systemic gender barriers, including by ensuring their freedom from gender-based violence. This is a priority that USAID has been working to tackle around the world. We are providing coaching to business leaders on how to build safe environments for women in their workforce. We are training local investigators on responding to sexual harassment and violence complaints. And a third component of our work is focused on increasing women's leadership and participation in unions in factories and businesses around the world, which recognizes that women are on the front lines around the world driving for necessary reforms with the support of male allies. But as we drive this work ahead through our investments around the world, we are also working to address this critical issue in our own workplace. So USAID has released a new operational policy on sexual misconduct, We've streamlined our reporting processes. We've instituted new screening measures in our recruitment and hiring processes. And we've expanded our training and awareness raising efforts for USAID staff around the world. We are also in the process of researching a new survivor-centered approach for providing support to individuals who experience gender-based violence in the workplace. We are thrilled to have this multifaceted approach to be elevating our attention as part of the administration's focus on women's economic security globally. We have new strategies coming out the door. In 2022, we will have the US government's first ever strategy on global women's economic security. We will have a revision of our our interagency strategy to address gender-based violence globally. And both of these will center and highlight the intersection of gender-based violence and women's economic security, where we recognize that GBV is both a cause and a consequence of women's economic insecurity. So very thrilled to be driving this work forward and to have the opportunity to work with the organizations represented here and partners around the world to make progress on tackling GBV in the world of work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really exciting to hear about the leadership at USAID on women's empowerment, and particularly as it relates to ending gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work. Next, we're going to hear from Kathy Feingold, who's the director of the International Department at the AFL-CIO, to talk about C-190 and the United States and the worker rights perspective. Kathy.
Thanks so much, Robin, and good morning, everyone. It is great to be here and to talk about one of my favorite campaigns to end violence and harassment in the world of work. This was a campaign that the AFL-CIO, and working I see with Robin, I know Cassandra's on the call, and some others who were allies in the creation of the US campaign to really, first of all, put this issue on the ILO agenda. I want to remind people that this was not a natural. Originally, this was not something that had a lot of support. And so this really, the first step was a campaign to make this a priority at the International Labor Organization. So that was step one. And so it was really great to be part of the process and working with Gabriella, who's on the call. It was business and labor. And in the end, our government, which in 2019 supported the adoption of Convention 190. It was a really exciting time, and it was driven, I'm proud to say, by union women in the business community, and in our government. But now we have the challenge, as we've heard about, to both ratify and effectively implement Convention 190. The convention really laid out an important framework to end violence and harassment in the workplace, and it's a powerful tool to help unions, women's organizations, and other allies to organize, educate, and shape policy agendas. And as others have already noted, we could not have really even imagined the set of crises we were going to be entering into as we were shaping this new framework. But I really think it's wonderful to see that this framework was really fit for purpose for this moment, for the set of crises we're facing, because it really deals with systems, with structural inequities, with power imbalances, with workplace imbalances. And so we had already kind of dreamt up a framework that is helping us get through attacks on democracy in the workplace and in our countries, growing income inequality, inequality between workers and their employers. So I think it really is exciting to know that we have this tool that is still really important. Now, one of the first questions I get anywhere in the world is, why doesn't the US ratify international conventions, especially Convention 190, which, you know, complies with a lot of US law, right? So this is, it should be sort of an easy one, as we thought Convention 111 should be, which is on discrimination. And I see my business colleagues saying even that one, business and labor can come together on. Really hard to move. Well, what I like to say when people focus on ratification, which we're proud that 10 other countries, and I'm glad Canada's hopefully getting in line there, is to say we think about it a little bit differently here as a labor movement, which is Ratification should be happening. Our country should be focused on bringing this framework to our own country. And I'm glad to hear Wendy bringing it into the Gender Equity Council and the important work you're doing. But the real question is, how do we build campaigns and advocacy that really bring this into our workplaces and in communities? So let me give a few examples of how we've done this before. Convention 189, which was also led by women workers and domestic workers. It's the convention to support domestic workers. Here in the US, we have not ratified it, but the National Domestic Worker Association used it to develop a domestic worker bill of rights. And they helped build out a global network of domestic workers. It became a really impactful organizing tool. That's what we need to do with C-190. So I'm not going to go through what Wendy, I had that in my notes as well, the exciting work you're doing. And I know, Robin, you've been part of it, is building out this government-wide focus. And I think it's really exciting that you have taken the framework, I want to use that as a concrete example, of C-190 and built it in. So we haven't ratified it, but we are building it into our new structures, our new frameworks that are going to be really powerful. And so that is really means that the US government is trying to uphold this important convention. The framework really incorporates some of the elements of that guide the administration, but has a spillover effect on other policy debates, like trade policies. Our generalized system of preferences is talking about gender-based violence now. We would have never had that conversation a few years ago. We are looking at our discussion in the COVID moment about expanding protections for all workers, including workers in non-standard forms of employment. This is part of the debate out of C-190, right? It's about all workers. How do you frame a problem about a structural issue? How do you talk about the fact that in workplaces where you have more precarious work, it's harder to report gender-based violence, right? And so this is a workplace issue about power imbalances at work. We need to solve that structural problem. And then we are going to be able to solve the structural problem of violence and harassment in the workplace. They go together. We need to look at the workplace issues. So we need the PRO Act in the United States. We need powerful workers in their workplaces. We need the work, Wendy, you're doing with the Gender Equity Council. We need to expand it so it's inclusive, LGBTQI workers who feel perhaps they can't speak out, migrants who can't speak out. This needs to be a tool for all of them. I know I have just a few more seconds, so let me give a couple examples where else I've seen this spreading in the US. We had the Be Heard legislation reintroduced. And again, they make the link on gender-based violence and workers who are dependent on the tipped minimum wage. We saw nurses using some of the framing in the introduction of their Workplace Violence Protection Act, right? Workplace violence issues, gender-based violence, this all comes from the framework. So let me end by saying, where are we going 2022 and beyond? Because that's where, we've had this convention as a tool. Well, in 2022, the global labor movement, the AFL-CIO, is proud to be part of this campaign. We're hoping to see occupational safety and health become a fundamental right in at the ILO. This will be key because this is a nice link to the gender-based violence work, right? Violence and harassment, helping to expand definitions of health and safety, occupational health and safety issues, bringing in gender-based violence. We need to have that work done. It's a great opportunity to work with employers on figuring that out. And then we need to make sure that occupational safety and health inspectors are trained for risk factors on violence and harassment, and they are empowered to investigate and remedy. We need to work with employers so that they're ready to deal with these kind of health and safety issues. So I'm sure we're going to be busy in 2022. I'm looking forward to it. And I'm really excited about the work we've done together so far to bring Convention 190 into reality in the US and around the world. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Really giving us a roadmap, right, about the critical tool that the convention is in really thinking strategically about how it's already being integrated, even without ratification. And so thank you so much for that, and really highlighting the intersectional nature, right, and the scope of the impact of the convention. Next, we're fortunate to have Gabriela Rigg Herzog, who's going to give us the perspective from business and employment, which is a critical partner, as we've been discussing. She's the Vice President, Corporate Responsibility and Labor Affairs at the U.S. Council for International Business. So please take it away, Gabriela.
Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you to the ILO for organizing today's panel. It's an honor to join such prestigious colleagues for today's discussion and to be able to represent the United States Council for International Business. As we noted in USCIB's message when we joined with colleagues on this call and with the ILO as part of the 16 days of action against gender-based violence, violence and harassment is unacceptable everywhere, and that includes in the workplace. And in far too many countries around the world, women face myriad barriers to meaningful participation in society. And this includes unacceptable practices of gender-based violence and harassment more broadly. And that's why U.S. employers were proud to join and contribute meaningfully and constructively to the successful adoption of Convention 190. It was an important discussion, and for employers, we had a number of goals. In particular, supporting the development of an instrument that brought clarity in terms of terminology and wide breadth in terms of coverage. We had these priorities because the aim is to really was to result in an instrument that would have the best chance and increase the prospects of ratification of that interest. And then, of course, the national implementation, which is so key. So we really focused on clarity, coverage, definitions were critical. One of the biggest gaps we had to fill was to have an instrument that would help governments have clear guidance to be able to use in a real and effective way to make a difference nationally for employers, for workers, and for governments alike. So clarity in terms of language regarding where is the workplace, who's a worker, who should be covered were really key. The breadth of the coverage was another priority for employers, and we were glad to see a broad approach. It included not just private employers, but also public sector employers, because violence and harassment risks are present in a full range of workplaces, including in the public sector. The informal sector was covered. This was critical because over 60% of the world's workers and businesses are operating in the informal economy. So they're considered as well. Employers were considered for coverage because employers also face risks of violence and harassment in the workplace. And so it was important for them to be covered as well. It was important to have an instrument that would be relevant because of the pervasive nature of violence and harassment, regrettably, in societies linked to deep-rooted biases and practices that we've got to break through. It was important to also recognize that the third parties are noted in the convention as well, because they may be either victims of or be directing violence. And so this is considered as well, but we were really clear in joining together to recognize that when it comes to an employer's responsibility, needs to be commensurate to their degree of control. And so this was critical for employers as well. So we've got the coverage, we've got the clarity, we're so pleased to see the 10 ratifications and 20 more we learned today from Manuela in her remarks on the way. It was the right topic, it was the right time, and now we need to move forward towards more ratification and implementation. There's a key role for states to play because the conventions apply to states, and so those discussions need to happen. But when they ratify and they pass those national laws in order to comply, those are the laws that employers are going to be held to. And so the path forward in terms of ratification and implementation at the national level is key. But if we're only at 10, we can't wait for everyone to ratify. And so ILO Convention 190 also serves as a very valuable guide to support employers, public and private, in the actions they can be taking. We heard some great examples from the United States and Canada today about different approaches they're taking with foreign assistance programs, or developing tools and training and guidance for public and private employers, and the full range impacted by this important issue. So we're glad to see the progress, and I look forward to sharing maybe a few concrete examples that we're seeing later on in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriella. Really exciting, and we look forward to hearing some of those examples. So at this time, I want to remind our listeners, our watchers, that we welcome questions for our esteemed group of speakers. So please use the Q&A feature to ask any questions that you may have. We have a good amount of time remaining here to get to some questions. And I think I'll start with one that we have, which are, goes back to what Gabriella just said, which is, what are some concrete actions that governments, business, and work organizations can take now to address gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work, including the impact of domestic violence? And I really open that to all of our speakers.
Well, sorry. Would it be okay?
Yeah, please go ahead, Gabriella. Yeah.
I mean, but I saw other hands, so I'll be brief. But you know, this is critical. You know, there's almost 60 countries in the world where there are no laws on the books to address workplace violence and harassment. And so, what to do in the face of that? I've been impressed by a couple examples. One is from a company, maybe you've seen it, there's a company in France, L'Oreal, and they've really launched this fascinating campaign. It's called, I want to get it right, the Stand Up program. But what's fascinating about it, Stand Up Against Street Harassment, is that this initiative is really beyond the workplace, right, of L'Oreal. But they've noted, based on research, the overwhelming number of women around the world who are impacted by street harassment. And as it relates to this convention, I mean, you know, your commute to and from work is included as part of the workplace. And so what could they do? This is beyond their walls. And so they've launched this important campaign with training to raise awareness about street harassment, give tools to ordinary citizens, maybe on that subway, seeing harassment, giving tools of kind of safe actions you can take to try and create an environment where that perpetrator feels uncomfortable and ceases the behavior. They've got a number of steps, and I really encourage everyone to take a look at that. And just, you know, a second quick example would be from Ecuador. Ecuador is one of the 10 countries that has ratified Convention 190. And there's this fascinating campaign. It's got some foreign assistance from the German government supporting it as well, but also the National Employer Organization, the representative to the ILO, on kind of an incentive program for Ecuadorian employers to put in a bid to be selected as a workplace that would receive nearly a year of capacity building and training to create the important culture of no violence and harassment in the workplace. And if they complete it, then they get like a special seal. The Ministry of Labor is involved, civil society, and of course, this a critical leader is the Ecuadorian employers. And so these are just a couple examples that give some hope and optimism of progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriella. Those are great. I see I've got Jimmy up next, please.
Great, thank you. Just to build on those really fabulous ideas. So first, Gabriella noted the legal gaps. And that's important as we look at national level efforts of the support that we can provide for legal reforms in countries, for the civil society movements, industry, advocacy, legislative action to close the legal gaps and ensure that the protections are in place to address gender-based violence in the world of work. Related to that, also to advocate for implementation of those laws. We all know that there are can be significant gaps between the laws on the books and what's in practice. We're also looking at industry level change. So we've been talking about how we can really support industries to take on and collectively take action to address gender-based violence in the world of work, and how we can all be using our platforms to influence the private sector in that regard. That's an area that we're exploring now through our Gender Equity and Equality Action Fund. There's also the importance of individual leadership within companies. So at USAID, for example, we have an Engendering Industries program, which works with partners around the world to increase the participation of women in male-dominated industries. And this includes specific efforts to coach leaders. We've done this with over 41 male-dominated organizations in nearly 30 countries. So to coach leaders on best practices that build safe environments for women in their workforce, and supporting reform within individual companies at national level. There's also a need to really focus on building capacity within those companies and across industries to then follow on with the commitments that they've made. We've got programs, for example, one in Lesotho that partners with companies in the garment industry. I raised before the example of training local investigators on how to respond to sexual harassment and violence complaints in factories. So of actually looking at the support we can give to companies at industry level, at national level, to be making the political leadership commitments and reforms, and then build the capacity to follow through on those within their companies to actually be building and creating safer environments. And then finally, we've been hearing the incredible work that women's movements are leading to help drive and support reform and progress. And that's an area which is central to ensuring our continued support for lifting up and really seeing the critical role to any progress of the frontline movements that women are leading around the world. So I would just highlight those components of the strategy we're thinking about at USAID. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamil. And I just want to lift up the Lesotho example, because the Solidarity Center is a partner in that worker-driven model of intervention in the garment supply chain. Is a really great example of something that is being done. And I want to also just lift up that the agreement signed by the manufacturers and the brands and the unions and the women's rights organizations in Lesotho is the first place that the language from C-190 is appearing in a legally binding document. And workers have set up an independent entity to handle complaints of gender-based violence and harassment from those factories. And they're running an independent, confidential information line. And then unionists are running education awareness programs in collaboration, right? And that's so critical, in collaboration with the manufacturers and the brands. And the manufacturers agreed that each worker needed to spend 2 days in a workshop, not just about what the law says and what the agreement says, but like, what do we do to change the culture in our workplace, right? Collectively, what's our collective responsibility? How did we get here? Why does this keep happening? So we're just so appreciative of the support from USAID, and that's a great model. So I've got Wendy, and then I've got Kathy, and then I've got Rakesh.
And sorry, just
yeah,
to
go
say,
ahead. Sure.
On that point, no, I'm so glad that you've shared more about the details of that intervention. I think that's so important for us to be highlighting where we're making progress, what are the components of those kinds of strategies, and to then be looking at, let's replicate that and do that kind of work in other countries around the world.
Thank you so much. Wendy.
Yeah, I want to double down. This is such a powerful conversation. I mean, Jamil, when you said, women's economic insecurity is both a cause and consequence of gender-based violence and harassment, so much of this is about financial abuse. And so I had mentioned earlier on that the Women's Bureau has a couple of grants programs, and I just want to lift them up. One is longstanding. It's really about ensuring, and you just said this in what you just shared. It's about ensuring that more women are gaining access to some of the higher paying jobs in the economy. But these are really still sort of quote unquote non-traditional occupations. And so, women are maybe moving from 3% of that workforce to, hopefully some bigger number, but it's still well short. And so being, the minority and in the minority, there is a huge power imbalance, as you said, Kathy, in what you said earlier. And so the amount of culture change work that has to happen alongside that investment to really, make sure that women's economic security is gaining by, and financial independence is gaining by getting access to some of those higher paying jobs, but then the amount of culture change that we have to do to really ensure that, they're not experiencing significant, which they are, high, levels of bullying and harassment and intimidation in those jobs. And so our WANTO program, Women in Apprenticeship and Non-Traditional Occupations, is really trying to address both of those things. Women's Bureau just launched a brand new grants program this year called Fostering Access, Rights, and Equity. So FAIR grants, that really is about making sure that workers know their rights on the job, and also that they're accessing all the income supports that are available to them. And, again, Kathy, to your point about power imbalance, one of the grantees in this inaugural round is the government of Guam. It's actually the Women's Bureau in Guam that is working to make sure that they're addressing the significant impact of domestic violence, especially coming off of this COVID experience, in the workplace specifically. And so a partnership between NGOs who have trusted relationships with these communities and also small business owners where most of the women are working, to really make sure that that feedback loop, that careful planning, that attention to enforcement and addressing things immediately, being prepared to address gender-based violence and harassment in the workplace is happening and happening at scale. So I think those are really exciting intersections that have come up in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I'm going to turn next to Kathy and then Rakesha. We just have a couple minutes left here. I apologize, but Kathy.
Yeah, so I'll just do a couple more because we are running out of time. I wanted to just give us some things to do going forward. So one is I wanted to bring in that piece, Robin, about worker-centered foreign policy, worker-centered policy that our administration is committed to, which really means taking these great concepts I'm hearing about, which are very top down, training a woman here, bringing women leaders, and building, worker solutions, those that are directly impacted, and bringing them into the conversation instead of having them receive the policies from high above, and really making sure workers themselves are the ones shaping it. I remember working in Haiti and we were working on gender-based violence issues, and I found out that, just to get a job, women were being asked to, have sex for a job. And so often, if you are not grounding yourself in workers who are directly impacted, you're not always finding the right solution. So a couple of things just to propose going forward: listening sessions, right, in the embassies and your USAID programs. It's so exciting to hear about them. Or iLab, Wendy, we can combine. Worker-centered means listening to workers. So how can we get some of these roundtables going in countries, hearing about their solutions, best practices, obstacles as informal economy workers? And then the second piece is, let's get ahead of this conversation around OSH. We don't need to wait. 2022 is going to be the year of OSH, and boy, do we need to talk OSH in this world. So let's convene some conversations to look at OSH and GBV. Let's proactively get those going. What are the what are the policies and workplaces that we need that are both about OSH, inspectors, education, and addressing gender-based violence. So I think we can already start building out an agenda. I know Kevin will probably bring us back together to talk OSH, but I'd like these pieces to be moving together and us to be thinking collectively about a proactive 2022 agenda.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Rakesh.
Thanks, Robin, and I will be brief because everyone has covered these topics so well, but I'll just touch on 2 points very briefly. One is we touched quickly on domestic violence, and I want to bring us back to that point because this was a key discussion item during C-190. And there was really a conscious decision to call C-190 a Convention on Violence and Harassment in the world of work as opposed to the workplace, because it goes so much further than that. And I think there was a recognition that domestic violence has such a significant impact on the workplace, on employers, and on the individuals. And certainly within Canada, we've put in place measures to try and encourage employers to have policies in place to provide protections for victims of family violence. We've made legislative changes as well, where we've brought in things like leave provisions for victims of family violence with 10 days of leave, 5 paid for those victims, urging employers and putting in place practices for them to work with those victims. This is something that impacts so many people so significantly. And in fact, in Canada, we estimate that Canadian employers lose about $77 million annually due to the cost of family violence. And so it's incumbent on us, not just morally, but economically, to put in place those measures. The second thing that I want to touch on is just to follow up on what Kathy noted around the worker-centric trade policy in the US, something we are appreciative and supportive of, and very much mirrors our inclusive trade policy, where we're strong believers in the idea that any free trade agreement needs to have strong labor provisions that provide protections for workers and individuals and addresses gender-based violence as well. And we hope that this is something that we'll see more and more countries adopting and that becoming a norm in trade agreements. Thanks for that, Robin.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our speakers. We are coming to the end of our time, but I wanted to give all of you, if you have a burning 30-second point that you want us really to walk away from this conversation with, to do that now before I turn it over to Kevin to close us out. So please, if there's this top line message you want to make sure that we come away with, I think you all just kind of did this, but just in case, please, I'll open it up to all of you.
You're muted, Robin.
I see Gabriella and then Wendy. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, and thank you just once again for today's opportunity. We're clear there's alignment and priority among governments, employers, and workers about eradicating violence and harassment, especially in the world of work, once and for all. We've got the great tool. We need more ratification, and we need to apply the ILO's special sauce, which is social dialogue. Workers, governments, and employers working together. And also please recall the key role that employer organizations as democratic institutions in each of these countries can play and wants to play to contribute to these shared solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Wendy.
Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't build on Kathy, what you said, that this is a framework for organizing. And coming from, prior to this post, coming from the world of organizing for paid family medical leave and paid sick and safe days, a lot of this work gets built right in the community because workers are calling for it, demanding it, needing it, and then seeing that reflected in public policy. So I think, that's an example of how things have really shifted to incorporate this framework in the safe leave provision. And, now's the moment to scale that for all workers. So thanks for this conversation. It's been incredible.
Thank you all so much. And that's a great place to close and turn it over to Kevin. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Robin, and to all the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to a close of today's program. Please join me in thanking our speakers for their contributions to this incredible discussion on a vital issue for a better world of work. Wendy Choon, Hoon, Director of the Women's Bureau at the Department of Labor, Rakesh Patri, Director General of the International Affairs and the Economic and Social Development Canada, and the new Chair of the Equal Pay International Coalition. Jamil Biggio, Senior Coordinator, Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment at USAID, Kathy Feingold, Director of International Department at AFL-CIO, and Gabriella Rigg-Herzog, Vice President of Corporate Responsibility and Labor Affairs at the U.S. Council for International Business. Also, a special thanks to Robin Runge for her excellent moderation of today's event, as well as her undeniable commitment and one of the pioneers in addressing gender-based violence and harassment in the workplace. Thank you so much, Robin. To our audiences, thank you very much for the time, and I trust you found this to be an exciting and informative program. Please visit the ILO website for further information and research on the human-centered approach, which, of course, the issues of violence and harassment in the workplace and the wider issues of inequalities sit very prominently within. Please join us in January of 2022 when the Global Discussion Series will begin again. And I hope you've enjoyed this inspiring and important discussion as much as I have. We look to all of you, our viewers, to do your part to end violence and harassment, particularly gender-based violence in the world of work. Have a wonderful holiday season. Stay healthy, stay safe. Thank you all.